And with that, I would like to introduce the host of our second panel. This is Christopher Livanos, Professor of Comparative Literature at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, the author of numerous articles on interfaith relations of the medieval Mediterranean. He's published Greek tradition and Latin influence in the work of George Scholarios from 2006, and co-authored with Florence Bernard the poems of John, co-edited the poems of John Maropoulos and Christopher of Mytilene, and that's from Harvard University Press in 2018. Currently, Professor Livanos is at work translating the pre-Islamic Arabic Odes in collaboration with Professor Mohammed Salama of San Francisco State University. So without any more delay, and thanks to everyone, but above all right now to Christopher, I would like to let the second panel begin. Thank you very much.
Hey, thank you. I'll introduce our first speaker. Maryam Fatima is a doctoral candidate in comparative literature at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, specializing in South Asian and Middle Eastern literatures. She works across Urdu, Hindi, Arabic, and English. Her dissertation, titled Partitions and Palimpsests, Transgressions of Form and Territory in Urdu and Arabic Post-Colonial Writing, postulates a new comparative arc for jointly studying literary responses to the simultaneous partitions of Palestine, Israel, and India, Pakistan, and their subsequent violent legacies of colonial and national border making. This dissertation has been generously funded by a Mellon Sawyer Fellowship, as well as the Interdisciplinary Studies Institute at UMass Amherst. Her work is forthcoming in comparative literature studies and critical global studies. She's also putting together a special issue on late Persianate comparatism with Mihat Ozdemir and Alexander Jabari for philological encounters. And without further ado, I would like to turn this over to our first professor, Maryam Fatima.
Not yet professor, but thank you so much, Christopher, for that introduction. And thank you to the organizers for putting this rich conference together. I hope I'm audible. My neighbor is very aggressively mowing his lawn right now. So I hope it wouldn't be too much of a disturbance, but the project that this paper is from explores the emergence of the historical novel or the Tarihi novel in Urdu at the end of the 19th century through the figure of Abdul Halim Sharar, born 1860, died 1926, arguably the form's pioneer in South Asia. Invested in fashioning an Islami Pablik or Islami Pablik in the subcontinent, Sharar wrote novels about the glories of a putative Islamic past as cautionary historical and religious lessons, or Ibrat, which is the word that he uses for the Muslim community. But before I delve into the paper, I thought it might be important, given the conference that we're a part of, to gloss the two terms that this paper is predicated on. So the first one being Ibrat and also Islah, two terms that come up both in the text that I'm analyzing today, but also in all of his other writings quite consistently, and sort of places him within the larger context that we know as evolutionary historicism or the dialectic of rise and fall, which is quite characteristic of 19th century reformist movements. So you have the Tanzimat in the Ottoman context, or the Nahda in the Arabic region. In South Asia, it's the Aligarh modernists. Okay, I'm able to share screen now. Okay. So Ibrat as an Islamic and Quranic concept implies warning or admonition. Writing against a surge of fatwas that came up against the novel for corrupting young minds with stories of love and romance, Sharar claimed that the moral education or the akhlaqi talim imparted by novels had the same operational logic as the Quran, where stories about the affairs of the world were revealed to the public, not to dispense judgment and issue fatwa like the ulama, and it's quite debatable the way that he characterizes this, but to demonstrate all kinds of denouements or anjam. In that sense, he imagined stories needed to be ibrat angez and offer cautionary lessons. The other term that he uses is Islah, and at that time it broadly meant religious and political reform, but also in an editorial sense in which he uses it implied textual corrections. So you'd find it customary to have cover pages that would state by Islah wa Tashi, meaning that the text had been proofed by a Musahi, a corrector, and this is quite common across Arabic Islamic editorial practices and emergent in the Urdu editorial sphere. The other term, of course, is the Islami Pablik, which is directly picked up from Sharar's essays, where he effectuates a dynamic relationship with his readers in order to create an Islami Pablik that would enable Muslims to achieve political agency in a post-Mughal world. Now, there's a whole matrix of meaning and connotations that is evoked when any of these terms come up that cannot be quite exhausted in English translation. My aim is to highlight what historical role these conceptual categories came to play in a changing context of a move away from a largely Persianate mode of literary expressions, which relied on lyrical genres or the ghazal, to a literary space rife with contestations across Arabic, Urdu, and English about what appropriate literary sensibilities were. I'll move to the paper now. So born in an age when education in Arabic and Persian adab had reduced one's chances of getting employed greatly, unless supplemented by an English education, Sharar taught himself English with the help of grammar books and translations from English to Urdu. He was greatly influenced by Altaf Hussain Hali's Musaddas, which is a long poem with stanzas of 6 half verses, and subtitled The Flow and Ebb of Islam, a canonical work for the Aligarh movement with its emphasis on quote-unquote natural poetry, on natural poetry that marked a distinctive break from the ornate style of Indo-Persian poetry and a move towards a poetics drawn from English Romanticism as a response to the perceived need to adapt and modernize. That Sharar was captivated by this dialectic of the fallen state of the Indian Muslim community and a putative glorious past is fairly evident through even a cursory glance at the many historical novels he published about Arabo-Islamic or Indian Muslim histories. After a brief stint at other journals, in 1887, he decided to start his own journal, Dilgudas, which ran for about 40 years. In 1907, Sharar serialized his novel Fatah al-Andalus, or The Conquest of Andalusia, in his journal, which was a tale about the conquest of Visigothic Spain by the Umayyad army led by Tariq bin Ziyad in the 8th century. This came 4 years after the Arabic novelist Jurji Zaidan had published his own Fatah al-Andalus, but from the perspective of a different set of historical actors. Both novels explored the many militaristic and ideological reasons for the ascension of Islamic Spain, but couched the historical lesson within a love story. Zaidan's novel introduced the love story of Florinda, the daughter of Count Julian in the Visigothic regime, and Alfonso, the heir apparent who's robbed of his rightful place. Sharar, on the other hand, wrote about the love between Isa bin Mazahim, a liberated slave in the Muslim army, and Maryam, the niece of Count Julian and Florinda's cousin. And I mean, obviously, the difference is depending on what sources they consulted for writing these novels. But in both novels, Visigothic King Rodrigue's injustices were posited as the driving force behind the Muslim campaign against Hispania. In the larger project that this paper is from, I do a parallel reading of the two authors and the two novels to bring out differences and similarities. But in today's paper, I'm more interested in the reformist agenda at play in Sharar's work, how, for example, markers of civilization and martial differences between Islamic and non-Islamic polities appeared in his work. He sought to expand both the geopolitical imaginaries and literary genres available to him at the time. The local and ethnic affiliation implied by the term Qawm was being redefined as nation to invoke larger imaginaries in terms of religious and national alliances. In this, his turn to the historical novel, and within it, the employment of narratives of past glories, enabled projections of pan-Islamism as a collectivity unimpeded by ethnicity, language, or nation. And for the purposes of this conference, drawing on Muhammad Saleh Umri, I want to flag this concept of what does it mean to novelize Islamic literatures, as sort of a continuous process of making other narratives look like the novel, a process in which the form of the Arabic, Urdu, or Persian novel collapses subsidiary narrative forms from within the broader category of adab. So you have the qissa, or the maqama, or the hikaya, riwaya, many such prose forms. Sharar wrote that in attempting his first historical novel, his training in Arabic and Persian had allowed him to recast Persian literary style, what he calls Farsi Inshā Pardazi, into modern English sensibility, or Jadid Angrezi Mazah. He had a love-hate relationship with Walter Scott, so he claimed that Ivanhoe had imbued him with romantic feelings or ashifana jazbat, but he had been offended by reading Talisman because of its mischaracterizations of Muslims. And so he started writing historical novels as a means to rectify Orientalizing representations of Muslims. Sharar conceived of the novel as the most perfect vehicle for ushering in modernity in Urdu, but he differed from other prominent literary reformers like Hany in that he refused to forego the idiomatic romantic language of South Asian Persian literature that had been renounced by the Aligarh school. He imagined novels to be the sweetener in a bitter pill, the bitter pill being education. Further, he thought they were accessible, so both the highly educated and the not so educated were able to enjoy them greatly in a way that histories just weren't accessible. In fact, he imagined that at times the long and complicated sentences of his novels were greatly enjoyed by his readers, but probably not entirely understood by them. And it is in this gap between entertainment and complete comprehension that his narratives and paratexts were wedged, seeking to clarify and educate wherever necessary. Now, beyond the more obvious objective of introducing Islamic history to his reading public, Sharar was also invested in familiarizing his readership with new genres. His historical novels then were not mere vehicles of Arab Islamic histories, they also functioned as primers on how to read these histories through the particularities of the form of the novel, which their readers had been largely unfamiliar with. Following the European model, he wanted to use novels for moral, religious, or political reform, and declared that British novels of the time, the reason that they chose to depict contemporary society as opposed to himself was because it was in that age that they found themselves most prosperous and civilizationally superior. So nations too prefer to listen to their triumphant and victorious times, which is why he would always write a historical novel and not a contemporaneous one. But in addition to the novel, there's also a larger economy of Islamicate or Persian textual traditions that likely came to bear on the Ibrat or the Nasihat coded in Sharar's work. These include Ibrat Nama, which are poetic works or chronicles in Persian centered around political unrest and transition. For South Asia, they're written about the Punjab region mostly. Imagined as political warnings, these were quite popular during his time. The other is the Ottoman Nasihat Nama, or the mirror for princes or advice literature that focused on statecraft, outlining such things as ineptitude in the Sultanate, lapses in law, or the corruption of viziers. This kind of political commentary, this mode of political commentary that was presented as a warning about the downward trajectory of a political system or injustices against a community, is figured into Sharar's novel as a critique of the corruption of the Visigothic regime, as well as the mistreatment of women and minorities under them that then becomes the condition for a superior polity to take over. For Sharar's reading public, there's also another historical warning. The golden age of Muslim Spain has been lost because of the corruption of Muslims over time, and the new Islami public that he's fashioning must rectify the situation. Now, it is mostly within this framework of the religious and communal edification of his publics that his paratexts can be analyzed. He uses footnotes to clarify Islamic injunctions and provide religious and historical context. So some questions that I'm raising through this project are, how does Sharar and his contemporaneous interlocutors like Zaidan read and render Islamic history at the turn of the 20th century, broadly conceived? Early perception of Sharar seems to have been dismissive. As one reviewer wrote, Sharar's fiction clipped incidents from history. It suffered from rootlessness. History is not interpreted or validated, but trivialized. But as one can imagine, such readings invisibilize the complex processes of redefining traditional historiography into newer forms that were at play in Sharar's work. As Muhammad Qasim Zaman notes, much of the historiography that Urdu scholars of the time adopted was animated by two concerns, critical and reformist. Both can be seen as a response to colonial modernity. Another significant point that such a dismissal entirely misses is that in addition to historical novels, he was also compiling histories. And so he wrote the Tarikh-e-Baghdad, the Tarikh-e-Islam. And by the time Tarikh-e-Islam, which was a 2-volume history of Islam commissioned by Osmania University in Hyderabad to be used for curricular purposes, he was already an established novelist. So clearly, he had strong credentials as a purveyor of Islamic history, which had not been damaged by his love of romance. And I think it's imperative to unpack the differences between these two modes of rendering Islamic past. What are the formal differences? What purposes did they serve? And how were they meant to introduce historicity among its public? Some other questions that come up, for example, are how did he draft well-entrenched and amorphous notions of tarikh into his theorization about the role of the historical novel? Tarikh by this time is already is a fairly saturated word for Persian and Islamic societies, and it becomes loaded with even more meaning and connotations. So you have history, historiography, Islamic history, European sources, a general sense of historicity. All of those are being implied each time that Sharar invokes tarikh. In writing histories, he had a set agenda and straddled multiple historiographical traditions and writing in response to Orientalist scholarship. So he's drawing on Arabic historiography, the works of Ibn Ishaq, Ibn Hisham, Tabari, Ibn Khaldun, European scholars such as Gibbon and Palgrave, as well as Urdu reformers like Sayyid Ahmad Khan and Shabli Namani. And he's quite meticulous about outlining these sources in his historical works, but in his novels, not so much. And I think it's because he's more interested in distilling a sense of the essence of an ascendant Islam, and he uses his footnotes in the novels for something other than citation. This novel can be contextualized within what Kavita Dattala has identified as a definitive moment in Urdu historiography at the end of the 19th century, marking its break from older Persian models and a move towards Arabic ones. Quote, Indian Muslims coupled their interest in Islamic history with an unprecedented effort to bring Arabic historiography into an Urdu public. Even if, as Dattala argues, Shara does not necessarily follow the verisimilitude emblematic of the Arabic traditions of Sira and Isnad, he still relies quite heavily on establishing a chain of narration. So he does not identify key historical sources within the novels, but I've personally made certain inferences about what works he might have consulted. So for example, the concluding paragraph of the novel suggests that the main source of his novel was Ibn Qutiyya's 10th century seminal history of Islamic Spain. At the end of the novel, after the conclusion of the conquest narrative, as Muslim forces take over the Visigothic kingdom, Shara introduces a conversion narrative. The young couple, Isa and Maryam, now united, travel with the Caliph to perform the Islamic pilgrimage of Hajj. Throughout the narrative, Maryam's Christian faith is extolled because of the sincerity and devotion she brings to her practice of religion. However, as she travels through the Islamic Caliphate and discovers historical and ideological overlaps in Christianity and Islam, she undergoes a change of heart and converts. As the couple move back to Spain, it is revealed that Isa is actually Maryam's cousin, a fact that no one knows, none of the characters know, who had been captured by the Muslim army as a young boy and eventually been liberated on account of his service to the Caliph. The idealization of Islam over Christianity is staged through Isa's character, whose twin perspective on the two religions bestows on him the legitimacy to claim one as superior. As the story concludes and the readers are informed that Maryam and Isa then retired to a place near Cordoba and led a happy life there. A genealogy is presented at the end as the omniscient narrator knows that Isa and Maryam, now part of the Gothic or the Qutiyya family, went on to raise intelligent children who served Islam well. And it says, they played an influential and admirable role in every stage of the Islamic Caliphate, and Ibn Qutiyya, who was a great literator and scholar of Andalus, was in fact from this family. So as we see, even without outrightly mentioning Ibn Qutiyya's history as a source, Shara sort of gestures towards it. And then there are other moments in the text, like there's a dream sequence that comes up, which was only written about by Ibn Qutiyya, that sort of lead us to believe that that was the main work that he consulted. Sorry. One of the textual locations of Shara's project of creating an Islami public was the paratext. The function of footnotes in Shara's novel is inextricably linked with the role of the narrator. Both elements mediate the readers through difficult conversations between characters and intercede to extrapolate or sermonize. The paratext of the novel also evinces a lesser investment in veracity and a greater one in reading Islamic history as a series of ethico-moral conundrums and projecting their resolution as part of the message of Islam. The narrator constantly stresses, for example, that the battle for gaining control of Hispania was fought on just ideals and as an ethical war, which was unlike the ones fought by the Christian armies. Through these passages, Shara educated not only his Muslim readers, who were presumably familiar with a lot of basic Islamic injunctions as well as history, but also sought to present and idealize pictures to his Orientalist readers. Towards this end, for example, Shara emphasized the different style of leadership that the Muslims seem to have introduced, where an equal treatment of and a concern for the fighting troops, their well-being and their aspirations was paramount. He uses Count Julian's character as an interlocutor between his British readership and Islam. For example, when Julian declares his intention to publicly display the dead body of a traitor to be fed on by birds and to stand in as an Ibrat for passers-by, a Muslim character, Musa, tells him that Muslims do things differently. The dead deserve a burial regardless of how they live their lives, because burial is a duty of the living, not a right of the dead. Shara uses this moment to instruct about martial protocols in Islam, which is a learning moment for Julian, who confesses that he thought of Muslims only as warmongers thus far. Now I'll quickly move through a few footnotes to exemplify what I've been saying. In this first one, as you can see, he's directly responding to Orientalist myths about the Prophet Muhammad, about Islam that had been circulating in Europe at the time. And he's also alerting his readers to what they would come up against when they went out in the modern colonial world as Muslims. So mischaracterizations, narratives about them, and sort of giving them the language with which to confront this mischaracterization. I don't think I have the time to read through the footnotes themselves, but I'll just I'll pause over it for a minute before moving on to the next one. In the second one, you see, this is a moment in the text when a fight has broken out in the Arab camp between which is a tribal matter. It's the Musa bin Nusayr, who's an important character in the movie, is trying in the novel, sorry, is trying to intervene to stop this fight. And Shura says that it turns out to be a tribal matter between Yemeni Arabs and Nizari Arabs. And the footnote to this section, Shura outlines the genealogical differences between the two tribes. The Yemeni tribes accuse the Nizari of not being Islamic enough on account of the Prophet being born to the Yemenis. And the footnote also reveals that the song that is sung, which leads to all these violent clashes, is so potent and provocative that every time it's sung, it results in violent clashes. So as an annotator here, Shura positions himself at a critical distance from this example of local and ethnic strife, and along with the third-person narrator, transforms this moment into yet another instructional opportunity about the importance of rising above tribal distinctions and banding together as an ummah. And of course, it's quite the historical veracity of a lot of this is questionable, but that's a conversation for another time. So in this one, he says, this footnote explains that unlike Iranian and Hindustani poets, Arab poets were not interested in concocting their verse around imaginary female figures, but they would identify real existing beauties of high society, presumably, and declare their love for them through their verse. Shura writes that this poetic expression of love was called the tashbih. The footnote makes no mention of the tashbih's historical place as the opening couplets of a qasida, and instead uses it to mark a distinction between Indo-Persian and Arabic poetics. Along with Shura's essays on language reforms of the time, where Persian literary style was being eschewed for those drawn from Arabic poetry, these paratextual moments in the novel, so the novel is serialized in his journal, right? And it appears alongside these other essays that he's writing. So there's kind of synergism between those two modes of writing. So these moments in the novel can be read as signaling to the journal's readership on how newer forms of writing expected a different readerly experience. While, as Kavita Dattla has noted, there was an unprecedented effort to bring Arabic historiography to an Urdu public, Shura's twin status as both a historian and a novelist testifies to how this historiographical turn also permeated into the question of poetics and prose. Through all of these paratextual interventions, Shura was educating his readers not only in the history that they were reading or on how to read it, but also impelling them towards an Arab and pan-Islamic affiliation. So in terms of a very unformed conclusion, I want to say a couple of things. Footnotes imbued literary text with historical erudition and intertextual depth, but they did so more in a informative and gestural way and less in any precise or irrefutable manner. Footnotes contributed to redefining notions of literature and literariness in the highly amorphous discourses of late 19th and early 20th centuries. The axis of comparison that I'm using for the larger project between Shura and Zaidan embodies a South-South comparative arc of doing world literary studies that circumvents the specter of Eurocentrism without entirely dismissing the formative role of imperial literacies and colonial pedagogies and the development of prose in Urdu and Arabic. Shura's novels provide more than a counterpoint from their formulaic European predecessors and recast the very contours of the form as well as narrative prose in Urdu. They allow us to think of the ways in which history has been constituted as fictionalized narrative and fixed truth at different historical junctures, not just particular histories such as those of Islamic Spain, but tarikh or history proper as a means of negotiating identities and tracing patterns of belonging. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker, Alaaeldin Mahmoud, is an assistant professor of English in the liberal arts department at the American University of the Middle East in Kuwait. He is a former Fulbright visiting scholar at the Ohio State University. He's an established translator who translated books of travel writing, fiction, and literary studies, notably his translation of Other Renaissances, a new approach to world literature, published in 2014. His scholarly interests include the Arab Nahda, literary translingualisms, multimodalities, and multiliteracies. Selected relevant publications include the Quran and Modern Arabic Literary Criticism from Taha to Nasr, published in 2018, Middle Eastern Literatures. Glocalizing the Arab Nahda, an investigation of the Nahda's literacies and multimodalities, Comparative Literary Studies 2019. Literary translingual practices in the Persianate world, past and present, in the Routledge Handbook of Literary Translingualism, forthcoming. He's also an active member in international organizations like International Comparative Literature Association and Middle East Studies Association. I'd like to turn this over now to Professor Mahmoud.
Thank you so much, Professor Christopher, and also, I'm very thankful to Professors Hany Rashwan and Huda Fakhreddine and David Larsen for giving me this incredible chance to present in this fantastic conference. My presentation today is about rethinking the art of composition or Inshā in the Arabic and Persian Maqāmāt, Badī al-Zamān al-Hamadhāni and al-Ḥarīrī in dialogue with Ḥamīd Balkhī. Okay, let me share my screen, I guess. I'm going to do so. Okay, can you see my screen? I wonder if
Yes, we see it.
oh, you can see my screen now, but
yes.
All right. Okay. So yeah, I need to make sure that I can see myself. Okay. All right. So my presentation today is I'm going to divide it into two parts. The first part is I'm going to somehow introduce, like have what I see as a necessary introduction about the history of writing, the history of the concept of composition in early art of writing. And I'm going to, like in the second part, I'm going to try to prove or answer the question of whether can we consider the maqamat, the Arabic maqamat, and then even the Persian maqamat as an exercise of pre-modern composition or even multimodal composition. So let me try to all right. So to begin with, I thought like I need to know more about the status of scribes or the status of writers in the very nascence of Islam, actually. And during that time, it was the time where Islam has started to become an empire. So that was actually with the start of or the very beginnings of the Umayyad Empire or the Umayyad state. So at that time, the very early Umayyad caliphs, they were looking for scribes. They were looking for writers. Writers who not only would write letters for them, or let's say diplomatic correspondence, documents for them, but also would be more of a counselor. So from the very beginning, the Arabs, I'm talking about the Arab rulers, the Arab caliphs, realized the necessity and the need for writers, the need for scribes. At that time, writers were actually, or the classes of writers, if we can say that writers were somehow forming classes. The classes of writers were basically in the two dying empires of the day, and I'm talking about the Sasanian Empire and the Byzantine Empire. So the Umayyad caliphs and the Arab conquerors, they were looking for what could be considered as modeling after what was the global practices of the day. So basically, from the very beginning of the Umayyad Empire, let's say, I think now I'm going to give you an example of one writer who was actually, he ascended to be very close to the caliph, to the ruler, Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, and you'll see how even if you read his biography, he was very close to that king or that caliph or that ruler, and he was a writer. One important thing about writing, or about the evolution of writing in the early Umayyad Empire or the early Umayyad state, is that there was some sort of a Byzantine influence. And for me, I see this Byzantine influence as basically in the transformation from brevity to prolixity and volubility. In the near past, during the time of the Prophet Muhammad, and I think even before that, in the pre-Islamic era, Arabs used to favor brevity or ijaz. The more brief you are, or is the better. So the brevity was the best, or one sign of elocution, eloquence. Later on, and due to the Byzantine influence, as I see it, the early Arab orators and letter writers have emulated the Byzantine rhetoric. And if we traced the status of the late Byzantine, or at the time of the rise of Islam, that the Byzantine rhetoric was infamously characterized by circumlocution. At that time also, scribes were, scribes who were actually working in the ex-Byzantine territories or the ex-Byzantine Empire, they were actually hired, or they found positions as scribes in the Umayyad, either in the Umayyad court or in the state's board of correspondence, or the UN of the state. So of course they would somehow retain some or most if not all of the ways of writing or the methods of rhetorical writing during their work under the Byzantine Empire. On the other hand, there was also a Sasanian influence, and this Sasanian influence was even more profound during the Umayyad state or during the Umayyad Caliphate, and even it has become even more pervasive during the Abbasid Caliphate. And some commentators, some critics, they were of the opinion that the ruling elite or the caliphs, the late Umayyad caliphs and the Abbasid caliphs, they were even favoring scribes of Persian descent, or scribes who were bilingual, like they were able to speak and write in Persian and Arabic, over those of Greek or Syriac or Aramaic or Coptic descent. The first, for me, like the first prominent writer who used to adopt what was called as the Persian style in early Arab writing or early Arab rhetorical writing is known as Rawh ibn Zinba al-Judami. He died in the year 703. And as I mentioned earlier in my presentation, that this writer and this orator and this actually chieftain, he was very close to the Caliph himself. He was one of the closest courtmen to him, and he described him in a quite famous quotation that was even mentioned by Muhammad Qurd Ali in his book Umara al-Bayan. He mentioned that Rawh ibn Zinba was Assyrian for his loyalty, an Iraqi for his calligraphic skills, a Hijazi for his knowledge of Islamic Sharia, and a Persian for his writing. Who came after the other writer, and some historians place him as the real beginning of I can call it historical writing, I can call it technical writing, is Abd-al-Hamid al-Katib. He died in the year 750. And his writing and his production is seen as the culmination of the Persian style in early Arabic writing and composition. The Abd-al-Hamid al-Katib was, again, he was bilingual and he was of Persian descent, and he was known as introducing the circumlocutory style. Instead of being brief, now it has become like the prolonged style in Arabic letter writing. And he was also known for being the first scribe to begin his letters with al-Tahmidat. So again, it was something that was well known by Abd-al-Hamid al-Katib. Now, I believe that from an early time, there were attempts by many writers, many famous writers, and I'm listing only a few examples of writings, treatises, monographs, and even encyclopedic works that try to theorize the art of Arabic composition, or what is known as Sina'at al-Inshā. So from a very early time, from the beginnings of the Umayyad state or empire, many writers and even later on in the Abbasid and even after that eras, many writers wrote, two other writers wrote about the how should other scribes compose letters, compose prose, basically. As you can see in this slide, we have al-Durra al-Yatima by Abdullah ibn Muqaffa. We have Risala ila al-Kutab by Abdul Hamid al-Katib. We have al-Kutab wa Sifat al-Dawa wal-Qalam wa Tasrifiha by Abdullah ibn Abdul Aziz al-Baghdadi. So even not only the technicalities of writing, but also even the non-textual, extra-aesthetic conditions of becoming a scribe, becoming a writer. How that was elaborately described in specific letters or specific treatises. Adab al-Katib and Risalat al-Khatt wal-Qalam by Ibn Qutayba, and he was also of Persian descent. الرسالة العذراء في موازين البلاغة وأدوات الكتابة by أبي اليسر إبراهيم ibn Muhammad al-Shaybani, and رسالة في علم الكتابة, even Abu Hayyan al-Tawhidi, and the 5th Hijri century also he wrote a risala, or he wrote a treatise for addressed to writers or composition writers about how to perfect the art of composition. The very famous encyclopedic work is by the al-Qalqashandi. I think he's very well known. صبح الأعشى في صناعة الإنشاء. It's a massive work, 15 volumes by Ahmad ibn Ali al-Qalqashandi. He died in 821 Hijri, so in the 15th century CE. Okay, so what I want to emphasize is that all these works in their entirety proved to be somehow or functioned as comprehensive toolkits, emphasizing the aesthetic and extra aesthetic elements of composition. And anybody who reads these works, you wouldn't see that the technicalities of writing, I mean the textual, is given more prominence to the non-textual. So both of them were there. Even you would see, I mean, anybody who reads, let's say, al-Durra al-Yatima, or anybody who reads al-Risala al-Adra, anybody who reads Risala al-Kutab by Abdul Hamid al-Katib, for example, you will see how they not only gave advice or tips to other scribes, other writers about the using various Badī and Bayan and Balagha devices, but also they were also elaborate on what I call extra or non-textual elements, like the quality of paper to be used, even the quality of pens, even book binding. They even went far to discuss the appearance, the physical appearance of the writers, the ethics. Other tips related even to how to write, what to do if you want to write a letter that includes encrypted messages, let's say, to a colleague or a governor, for example. So I see all this as they call it indigenous or Arabic practice of pre-modern Arabic multimodal composition. And I say that it's multimodal because it's not limited to the text. It's not limited to writing text. It is more than that. If we read, let's say, Subh al-Asha, for example, we will see that Al-Qalqashandi and even other sources testified that al-Maqāmāt, or the Arabic Maqāmāt, are somehow the culmination of composition. I know that in the literature, there are many, or most of the scholarship is about Maqāmāt and about the history of Maqāmāt, about the influence of, let's say, how let's say, Arabic Maqāmāt influenced, let's say, Persian Maqāmāt, or even Hebrew Maqāmāt. Comparison between Maqāmāt Badī al-Zamān with al-Ḥarīrī. A lot of scholarship has been done on the even the illustration and the evolution of Arab painting, and how artists and illustrators like al-Wasiti, for example, how they received Maqāmāt, like Maqāmāt al-Ḥarīrī, for example. Here in this presentation, I would focus more on Maqāmāt as exercises of composition. And I think we also know that Maqāmāt, let's say Maqāmāt al-Hamadhāni, because they came earlier than Ḥarīrī's, they were composed and they were designed for pedagogical purposes. So basically, it was about teaching Arabic composition. So that was one of the primary functions of al-Maqāmāt, that they were about to teach Arabic to students. At the same time, the writing of Maqāmāt, or the composition of Maqāmāt, was basically rested upon the idea of al-Tasannu, or artfulness. Of course, this is opposed to al-Tabba, or the natural disposition or talent. So it's not, writing is not a talent. Writing is a skill, and that students can master if they practice. And this is actually even the contemporary definition of composition. That's even anybody who teaches composition will have the same definition. Not only this, I have also an idea of perceiving or seeing Maqāmāt as not only a practice of Arabic composition, but also we can also see it as a practice of Arabic multimodal composition. Of course, we can see the pictures of, or illustrations actually, from basically by al-Wasiti. So that's an illustration from the al-Hadd. You can see here in this slide, and you can see those young kids or children even, and they would have they have those like tablets for writing. So composition, teaching Arabic composition was not far at all from the writing of al-Maqāmāt. Now we will need to talk about the non-textual, the visual, the illustration, and my argument about this is that illustrating Muhammad for composition, basically most of the Maqāmāt were not really illustrated, but we need to think of, let's say, the time when Maqāmāt were illustrated. That was during the time when as I'm quoting Oleg Grabar, the whole Muslim world exploded with images. So at the time, it was actually illustrating the Maqāmāt was some sort of a response to some societal or even audience-related needs. Relevant to this also is the idea of literacy. So when we talk about students, when we talk about teaching students Arabic composition or teaching Arabic to students, also we need to think about literacy. We need to think about even visual literacy, like how people were able to understand, to appreciate and understand pictures. And I drew also on Grabar's, Oleg Grabar's arguments about the attitudes of the Arab illustrators. So not all the illustrations were the same. Some of them were very literal, like literal commentary on the text. Some of them were a little bit descriptive, some of them even interpretive of the text. And even some of them were purely visual, like they stop being illustrations and they are appreciated purely for their visual value. I'm going to finalize my presentation with Maqāmāt Ḥamīdī, or the Maqāmāt of Ḥamīd ad-Dīn Balkhī. And Ḥamīd ad-Dīn Balkhī is known as like the most famous figure in Persian literature to emulate Maqāmāt and write them in the Persian language. I'm going to also try to make combination between the concept of tasannu in Arabic and the concept of sabk, which I borrowed from Muhammad Taqi Bahar in his book Sabk Shinase, Ya Tarikhi Tadavvuri Nasri Farisi, Stylistics or the History of Change or Development in Persian prose. Bahar introduced the idea of sabk or style, and I think that he also made use of the famous classification of the distinct styles of classical Persian poetry, Sabki Khurasani, Sabki Iraqi, and Sabki Hindi. And of course, it's obvious that at the time, or the Maqāmāt Ḥamīdī belong to the Sabki Iraqi, where the rhetorical or the ornate style was trending. Okay, so he was basically following the Arabic style, tasannu. But at the same time, he was not just an imitator. He also he was able to fashion his unique type of composition, which made him somehow unique. So basically, you can see this picture of this is the first page of Maqāmāt Ḥamīdī, and he used bilingualism. So his Maqāmāt were, we can find Arabic text, we can find Persian text. So for me, I see it as merging tasannu with sabk. and that was somehow a way for him to tell his readers that he was not lacking in the instrument of the Arabic Persian, like he could write in both languages. And even though that he was, I mean, it was very obvious that he adopted tasannu and the word choices and even the structure of the sentences were somehow
I'm sorry to interrupt, but just I wanted to just make sure there's a quick reminder that we do stick with the time frame. And I know that you did mention that you're concluding, so I apologize for the interruption, and I'll let you.
No, it's okay. This is my final. Okay, so in a nutshell, Balkhī's Maqāmāt were somehow unique in how he developed his style, and at the same time also he was following Badī al-Zamān and al-Ḥarīrī as masters of the Arabic Maqāmāt. And thank you so much for listening, and my apologies for exceeding the time.
No, not at all. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Let me bring my video back up. Our next presenter, Simon Lees, is a postdoctoral researcher at Utrecht University in the ERC-funded census project, The Census of Islam, A Cultural History of Perception in the Muslim World. He completed his PhD at SOAS in 2019 with a thesis titled Longing for Salma and Hind, Reproducing Arabic Literature in 18th and 19th Century North India. His research focuses on the connections that poetry has forged between the Middle East and South Asia, and investigated how meanings of Arabic poetry in India have been inflected by multilingualism and imaginations of geography. His publications include Arabic Utterances in a Multilingual World, Shah Wali Allah and Quranic Translatability in North India, Translation Studies 2021. I'll turn this over to Dr. Lees.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Chris, that's very kind. I'm going to try and share my screen. The first slide. Okay. Can you see the whole screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Well, yeah, I just want to echo the thanks to the organizers, Hany, Huda, and David, and Rawad, of course. No, it's really it's a pleasure to be among so many great people speaking about so many fascinating things. Yeah, so thanks again. Now, in my paper today, I'll be discussing 18th and 19th century Indian poets and critics whose cultural life was necessarily multilingual. So there's one of these multilingual hubs that you know, that like many of us were looking at. And for them, acts of implicit and explicit comparison between the forms, genres, and poetic worlds of different literary idioms were almost inevitable. Some of these figures wrote poetry in Arabic, but also wrote in or were connoisseurs of Persian, Urdu, and other languages such as Braj Bhasha, the North Indian poetic idiom. What I focus on here is their use and discussion of a seemingly non-Arabic formal feature in their Arabic poetry. This is the Radif, a rhyme form very common in Persian and Urdu, consisting of a repeating refrain made of a word or group of words that follow the main rhyme letter of every verse. Now, I struggled a little bit to come up with a catchy title that describes this process, and I landed on bringing, but it doesn't really, like words such as boring and imitation, it doesn't really do justice, and probably the opposite. In fact, it kind of obscures really what's going on. And this is something I'm going to return to later at the end of the talk. I've also expanded what I'm talking about into the 19th century, basically. So if I have time, I'll look at some 19th century printed manuals on prosody and rhyme. And hopefully this will be manageable over time. Having said that, so I'm just going to put my timer on. Okay. So I'm actually going to begin with a tangent. It's no secret that in archives across South Asia and in collections taken from South Asia, there are huge numbers of Arabic manuscripts and printed books. This massive textual archive is demonstration enough that Arabic has played an important part in South Asian cultural life alongside other languages. But the now common practice of splitting collections by language, as well as by sometimes clumsily schematic genre categories, confuses our understanding of how different languages and textual traditions have existed, not just side by side, but in between and through each other. This becomes even more apparent with manuscripts and books that are themselves multilingual, or texts that defy easy genre classification, such as the series of devotional poems I will briefly show here. Together, these texts illustrate how comparison in a multilingual milieu could be a poetic practice, enacted through the skillful manipulation of form across different languages, and also through making the sonic qualities of those languages resonate with each other. And by sonic qualities, I mean their refrains, echoes, and rhythms that constitute their respective formal systems of prosody and rhyme. This first text is from the Nadwat al-Ulama collections in Lucknow and is a well-known munajat. So these are intimate words directed in this poem to the Prophet. There's a more famous, I think, related poem with an internal expansion, which was apparently written by the Ottoman Sultan Abdul-Hamid I and engraved on the wall of Hujra of the Prophet's mosque in Medina in the 18th century. Now this poem here, as we would expect, has a monorhyme, the Adi. So yeah, Habib Allahi khudh bi Adi, mali adsi siwaka mustanidi. And the final word of this poem, which I want to draw your attention to, I think I'm going to try and do this. Can you see a laser pointer here?
Yes, we can.
It's al-Madad, al-Madadi, which means aid or succor. It's some, the support or aid, succor, sought after from the beloved Prophet. I ask you to keep that in mind just for 2 minutes. You see the Persian glosses are written under the Arabic, which are not versified. So here they really function to guide as a guide to meaning for the Arabic poem when it's recited. In this next example, Persian comes in between the Arabic verses as a poetic language, as a rhyming and rhythmic sonic presence. This is from the British Library's Delhi collections. This is the same munajat poem as a previous example, but with a bilingual takhmis, or fivefold expansion, produced by adding 3 half verses in Persian to each Arabic verse. This expansion can be seen as a form of translation, and it also expands on the original poem's themes by describing further attributes of the beloved Prophet, and restating the devotee's longing and devotion to him in a series of new ways. This formal intertextual amplification is fundamentally sonic. New rhymes are produced upon the half verses of the Arabic original, with the original rhyme of Adi returning as a refrain at the end of each stanza. So we have, if you can see here, we have Persian, 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 Arabic, Arabic, Persian, 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 Arabic, Arabic. Many of you will be familiar with this form. The final example is a manuscript from Rampur. This Persian munajat, whose author is not indicated in the manuscript, follows immediately after another popular devotional Arabic poem attributed to Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, and this poem is addressed to that same revered sheikh. Here, the notion of madad, of aid and succor, becomes a formal radif, a repeating refrain at the end of every verse that follows after the regular rhyme of an. So now we have a repeated phrase of madadi. So you provide me succor, or you provide me aid, and this is what I seek from you. And this accentuates the wish of the devotee to receive the aid of the sheikh, together with his guidance towards knowledge of the unknown, sought through the act of speaking intimately with him. And this repeating refrain, which you can see here, all the way down, and I've got the rhyme here before it of an. The repeating refrain accentuates the sheikh's ability to provide the devotee with that knowledge. Now, the effect of this radif is built on sound, but also intertextual knowledge of munajat poetry, since the appearance of madadi as a refrain in the Persian munajat inevitably echoes the rhyme of the popular Arabic munajat from the first 2 examples. This, together with other examples, with the other examples I've shown, suggests that the multilingual world of these texts was not only one of motifs and themes shared within and across separate languages, but a sonic world, rhythms, rhymes, and refrains echoing across them. For reciters of older Arabic poems, authors of new poems, and their audiences, the ability to recognize and enjoy poetry not only depended on intertextual knowledge, not least because many, I think, in the audience and even reciters might not have known Arabic in the way we think about language knowledge today, or even Persian. I think their ability to enjoy it and recognize it was depended as well on intersonic knowledge, what we might say. Now, in this multilingual world of India in the 18th and 19th centuries, the Arabic rhyme of Adi and the Persian Radif of Madadi shared an obvious affinity. But this evidence of Persian and Arabic moving in between and through each other as sonic echoes raises a question: what were the boundaries between these languages, and how did poets maintain them or break them? The Radif itself was such a fundamental feature of the Persian and Urdu ghazal that was regularly heard as echoing refrains in poetic performances and gatherings, not just in North India, but beyond, that it was perhaps inevitable that poets would also experiment with it as a feature in Arabic poetry. This is interesting because I wrote in my abstract that it's kind of against the grain. So it's kind of the wrong way in terms of how we, historically and also maybe conceptually, we think of how Persian and Arabic kind of interact with each other. Persian takes from Arabic, and we tend to see few examples of the other way, or we tend to think that it doesn't happen. That's not exactly true. So later, now and later, I'm going to touch on two multilingual poets in 18th century India who indeed recognized that the Radif was outside the normal bounds of Arabic poetry, but they incorporated it into their Arabic poetic repertoire all the same. So for these two poets, Ghulam Ali Azad Bilgrami from a small qasbah in North India, and his younger contemporary and rival Muhammad Baqir Agha basically from Madras in the south, how to define and circumscribe the Radif was one point of contention in a wider dispute they had about multilingual poetics. I think quickly I have a map. These are all places so Azad came from Bilgram, but he went on Hajj through Surat and he settled in Aurangabad. Agha comes from Madras, but also he traveled across the Deccan. So yeah, they're connected in some way with their travels. Now for these and other multilingual poets who wrote in Arabic and other languages, including Persian, Urdu, Dakhni, and Rajbhasha, were in a sense theirs to compare and stretch the boundaries of. And I'm borrowing stretching from a recent piece by Francesca Orsini. She talks about language stretching as a way to think about how different, people, poets and connoisseurs in a multilingual environment literally stretch the boundaries of languages in certain ways. When I say theirs to compare, they were perfectly capable of composing and enjoying poetry in these languages. So they weren't foreign languages really. At the same time, the stretching and recognition of the limits of doing so were not neutral or detached acts of comparison. Nor did they entail poets such as Azad and Agha only looking towards themselves and the multilingual poetic knowledge they shared with others in their local milieu of India. Instead, comparison was an act of looking both outward and inwards at the same time. To put it another way, when they composed Arabic poetry with a Radif, they did so in the knowledge that it was a formal feature that was not strictly what the Arabs do, and I put that in quotes, but rather what the Persians do, invoking the authority of the relational terms Arab and Ajam that not only signify Arabic and Persian, but past peoples and places associated with those languages. By using these terms to describe multilingual poetics, Azad, Agha, and others made comparisons centered not on themselves, but on distant and authoritative poetic pasts that were, both grammatically and symbolically, third persons. At the same time, the concern of these Indian poets with what the Persians do and what the Arabs do is what made their own experiments with the Radif in Arabic potently meaningful in a multilingual culture. I put these terms on the slide here. There's these things for I could talk about what I won't do today, but sometimes it's Furs, sometimes it's Ajam, and also Hind comes up. And together these terms, they bring out the multivalency of each other, I think. So in terms of people, place, and language, because they often come together. Now, Azad Bilgrami is certainly foremost among Arabic poets in India who diverged from the forms, themes, and conventions of Arabic poetry. He cultivated and articulated his persona to a self-consciously multilingual approach to poetics, particularly in his translation of Sanskrit rhetorical figures into Arabic in Shobhat al-Marjan fi Athar Hindustan, a core rosary of Indian traces. And also across his many Arabic diwans, he had lots of, he took up lots of unusual poetic forms, we could say, into his multilingual arsenal. And he really did understand these as coming directly from Persian. So his sixth Arabic diwan contains tarjih poetry. These are long poems and stanzas with different rhyme schemes, separated by refrain that may or may not contain repeated rhymes. Also a kind of a strange, we might say, in Arabic rhyme scheme. And he provides an explanation of this in the Diwan, saying that although some poets have used it in Arabic, such as Sadi Shirazi, it was Persian. And also he has a Diwan completely dedicated to poetry with Arabic poetry with radifs. Sorry, 1 second. Yeah, sorry. So he devoted his 4th Diwan to showcasing this apparently Persian form. Now, this example, there's lots of examples, and I've got to look at them more carefully. This one I've looked at very briefly. Written in 1190 or 1776, it's a rather interesting poem with the rhyme of Ati and a radif of Ba'id. And each refrain of Ba'id, which means distant or unattainable or unlikely or something like this, adds to a series of aphoristic statements about love and the special status of the poet lover, with a new dimension of distance, unlikelihood, and unattainability. The poet, as a true devotee, is distinguished and therefore distant, Ba'id, from others who are content in their ignorance. At the same time, striving for union with the unattainable beloved is also Ba'id, it's futile. In this poem, it is as if looking at this poem, it's as if the whole of each of the second half verse, the ajuz, is a separate rhetorical, rhythmic, and rhyming refrain, rounding off the propositions put forward in the first half verses. And just coming back to what Huda was saying about theory happening, she was talking about the Talmiya poem, picking up on Ali's paper. For me, it's more than just a form here. It's almost a motif in itself, because it's not Arabic. So there's something. For me, he's also saying something about multilingualism, and what languages belong to him and where he belongs and so on. Yeah, this is something I've got to think through a bit more closely, but yeah, that's some kernels of thought. And this is another example from the 19th century, a manuscript, someone who's also using a radif in their poetry. Just incidentally, these 3 poets and others also used what we think of a Persian takhallus, a pen name, in their Arabic poetry, and I've written about this a bit in my PhD work. Now, back to this dispute between Azad and Agha. I'm not sure that they ever met in person, but between about 1781 and 1784, when Azad was in his 70s and living out his life in his final years in Aurangabad, they corresponded with each other in order to exchange bitter accusations and criticisms about how to do multilingualism properly, basically. So how to negotiate these boundaries between Arabic, Persian, and Rajbhasha, so Indian languages. And it's actually, happily, it's preserved in this mixed language Arabic and Persian manuscript, where it preserves this back and forth between them. Yeah, which is it's very interesting to read. Their disagreement about the radif is mostly about its definition, and whether Agha has been correct when he claimed that some of his own Arabic poetry featured the radif. In their statements about the form, they both touch upon or echo older critical discussions written in Persian about how to define it, as well as drawing on kind of classical examples of its classical early examples of its use in Arabic, which are found in earlier Persian works on rhetoric and prosody and so on. Now, curiously, before dedicating this whole Arabic diwan to the radif form, Azad had previously been rather ambivalent about whether it worked in Arabic. So this is from Sohbat al-Maljan, which he completed just about a decade before he wrote the poem I discussed earlier. And so he defines the radif and speaks of its beauty in Persian, and states, sorry, I can't see my slide anymore. Persian poets have the radif, which is one or more independent words that repeats after the rhyme letter. Poetry with a radif is called muraddaf. There is no radif in the poetry of the Arabs, and I've highlighted that for a reason. If somebody goes about composing radif poetry in a forced manner, it never turned out sweet, like it does in the poetry of the Furs, of the Persians. The only reason for this is the specificity of different languages. I won't talk about this today, but I find this idea of khususiyat al-lisan very, very interesting. Now, so Azad was clearly comfortable with adopting the form and other devices into other apparently Persian forms and devices into his Arabic, and also engaging all sorts of multilingual experiments, we might say. So it's interesting that at least momentarily the Radif caused him some sort of anxiety. And what I find interesting that is this recourse to the third person. So these Persians who are, they're not modern Persians, they're al-Ajam al-Furs, the Persians of the past, who hold the authority to define what the bounds of Persian poetry are, and also al-Arab as well. And he's talking about, of course, he's talking about the ancients. Now the manuscript I mentioned records a kind of more extended dispute about this. I won't go into it in too much detail, but these are one of Agha's objections to Azad. So he disagrees about the definition. So he says Azad's definition gives a false impression that the Radif for them, the Persians, cannot consist of a single letter. This is incorrect, since the letter Sheen as a pronoun, meaning in Persian, and similar letters can also be a Radif, even though they're not independent words. The correct definition is that the Radif is one or more word or letters. One more word or letters, sorry. Now, this argument actually arises from a lack of clarity, a partial lack of clarity in the earlier critical tradition in Persian. And Agha actually appeals to the authority of Nasiruddin Tusi, who does give a wider definition of Radif in Ma'yar al-Ash'ar. This is just something I don't really want to get into today, but what I'm interested in, of course, is how they talk about, is how they frame the debate. So they're actually talking about, in this discussion, they're really talking about what each other is doing. They're really saying me and you, but they're talking about the third person, but they're kind of framing it in terms of third persons. They do, on occasion, use the grammatical first and second persons, but mostly they look to distant third persons, the distant third persons of the Arabs and Persians, which I said earlier, they're distant in time and place. Even though Arabic and Persian are really, we might say they are living languages of India at the time. I should be rounding up, I think, very quickly. So these are printed manuals from the 19th century. They draw on, I think, some specific examples and even language from earlier Persian works on prosody and rhetoric and so on. But they're interesting because they also appeal to the authority of al-Ajam. They do use some interesting words though, which that you have the same idea of specific characteristics of languages here. We do have this word ikhtira, so an invention of the Ajam, which is interesting. And this one's interesting, more interesting. So he says some of the moderns have followed in the footsteps of the Ajam. So ataw bihi iktifahan bihi. So they came to the Radif following in the footsteps of the Ajam. This is something I've got to think a bit more about. I will finish though with a little passage from Azad Bogrami's Persian partial translation or adaptation of parts of Sufat and Marjan, this amazing work of kind of comparative poetics. So this is a Persian translation of it, which is kind of shifts things and shifts the associations that he draws between different languages. But it's a nice passage I always return to. So it should be known that just as the turtle doves of the Arabs and the nightingales of the Persians have soothed the ear with melodious voices, the parakeets of India have delighted the palate with sweet relishes. Anyone who is well versed in the three tongues arrives at the essence of poetry. Now, the three tongues for him are Arabic, Persian, and more Braj Pasha than Urdu. at the same time and later in the 19th century would probably think of Urdu when they said the three tongues. And maybe he means Sanskrit here as well. It's a bit, he means the languages of Hind in general. Now, what's interesting here is that he's really talking about himself. He's talking about himself as a multilingual poet, and he's talking about his audience. This bayad means someone you should know, someone he's speaking to. So he's really implying a lot of, a statement about himself as a first person and a statement about what the second person should know. But he's but grammatically, and symbolically and so on, he's talking about these distant, geographically and temporally distant third persons. Yeah, and this is really this. I've got to kind of figure this out a bit more, but this is, I want to think about what does this mean for comparison. He's looking really at what he's doing, but also looking outwards and backwards in time, outwards in space and backwards in time. But really to say something about himself. Yeah, which is obviously so even using the Radif poetry is really for me an act of looking back in time, which is really quite, it's not captured by ideas of bringing into or borrowing or imitation and so on and so forth. Yeah, and that's it really. That's all I'll say today. One thing which I didn't talk about is Ajam, of course. It's said that it becomes a neutral marker, a neutral term for Persia and Persian. I'm not sure that's necessarily true. It does carry this sense of other than Arabic. So I think looking at how these poets talk about Arabic actually has probably implications with how we understand, Indo-Persian and all that whole debate and what Ajam means in India. Yeah, and but that's a kind of side. Yeah, that's it. I'll be very interested for any questions that come later. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Forward to discussing all of the presentations. Fourth panelist today, Orhan Elmas, is a lecturer at the University of St. Andrews, where he teaches Arabic language, literature, and culture, and comparative literature. His research focuses on Arabic linguistics, more specifically the emergence and development of Arabic and the philological and rhetorical exegesis of the Quran and its use and abuse, as well as digital humanities, especially corpus and computational linguistics. Recently, he's finished a volume on adaptations of 1001 Nights, and his current research is dedicated to a corpus linguistic exploration of Hadith Arabic and transcultural Muslim women's rights movements in the 19th and 20th century. Dr. Elmas, thank you.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and also thank you very much to the organizers of this conference, where I think we will all be able to learn a lot over the next 2 days as well. I will start timing myself, and I'll try to stick to the time limit of 20 minutes. I would like you to be a little patient in the beginning, because I'll try to sum up a few things, just skip them, and then I will dig in with yourselves into some texts which I find quite interesting, where we can see the development of the wine motif. Come on? Okay, so contemplating wine poetry in the Arabic and Ottoman context, one will acknowledge that they seem worlds apart, especially pre-Islamic poetry, where wine drinking is ever so often found in the context of two of its main themes, namely boasting, fakhr, and praising others, madh. For instance, Prince Vagabond Imr al-Qais, who lived between 520 and 565, is credited to have praised Sa'ad ibn al-Dibab's generosity for bringing wine and camel meat in mornings while satirizing Hany bin Mas'ud. However, we wouldn't be doing justice to wine in Arabic poetry if we were to restrict its use as a motive to its plain meaning only. Although the description of consuming wine and intoxication beyond excess at various times of the day may ring hollow, wine fulfills different functions in poetry, which holds true already for the larger body of pre-Islamic poems. Unsurprisingly, in a few of the famed pre-Islamic odes, the so-called mu'allaqat, suspended odes as Arbery imagined them, one can find the poet boasting about drinking expensive and delightful wines. Antara, 525 to 608, boasts about drinking excessively around noontime and squandering all his goods and chattels on mudama, wine, which he drinks from an intricately decorated, luxurious zujaja glass. He is not trying to say that he is a drunkard nor a sophisticate, but very much to the contrary. He is meaning to show off his virility by emphasizing that he is holding his drink and that heavy drinking does not impair his honor either. Still lavish when he sobers up. The most elaborate passage relating to wine is, however, found in Taraf ibn Abd's Ode. He lived from 543 to 569. Similar to Antara, Tarafa also states that he has squandered all his possessions for wine, but to the extent that his family banished him. And he also provides some context for wine drinking, namely that it was consumed in taverns. He also describes a delicate and desirable singing slave girl that actually personifies spiced wine in his poem. Moreover, he expounds on his enjoyment and sheer love of drinking and his fear that once he will die, all pleasure will come to an end. This very last and romantic idea is also found in two verses that have come down to us by the Enophile poet Abu Mihjan al-Thaqafi, who died in 638, or after that, in which he advises his son to bury him under a grapevine out of fear that he may not be able to taste any more wine when he is dead. The self-evident nature of wine drinking in pre-Islamic poetry is substantiated by the rich and accurate vocabulary surrounding the description and depiction of the context of wine drinking. To add to the previous examples, Amr bin Kulthum, 526 to 584, describes a sabuh, a morning drink, out of a sahan, a bowl, which takes a saffron hus hue when musha'asha'a, mixed with water, and which makes the lover forget his heart's pain when drunk. He describes wine drinking as both a social as well as an individual act. When drinking in groups, a kas, cup, or khamr of khamr, wine, is passed on to the right between individuals. Nobody is meant to saban al-kas, to turn away the cup, lest its joys come to an end. The poet also reminisces about many a glass he enjoyed in the probable Levantine centers of wine culture at that time, namely Baalbek, Damascus, and Qasirin. In Labid's ode, he lived from 560 to 661, supposedly, we learned that he buys sibā, which is wine that is bought to be drunk, for a higher price from a tajir, a taverner, in ātiqs, those are wineskins. The mudam, wine, is making him long for a girl singing and playing the lute, already imagining the ta'alil, which is the second wetting of his lips with wine. We know from later poetry that wine could be served by singing slave girls who at times dressed up as boys, ghilman. However, his contemporary Al-Asha, who lived from 570 to 627, describes fondling his beloved who had prepared a ta'mura, an ewer for wine, for them to have. It is this joy of drinking with or because of one's beloved that we will encounter many a time in Ottoman poetry below. Yet, wine is laden with many more connotations in this setting than just giving joy to the drinker or making him forget his sorrow. Already in pre-Islamic times, wine was used as a metaphor to express joy and slowing down or slurring one's speech. Imru al-Qais says this of finches in the morning after the great cataclysmic storm seen at the end of his Mu'allaqa. The bird, the finches, were as if they had been given sulaf min rahiq mufalfal, the choices of sweet wines rich with spices, to drink. In descriptions of female beauty, shiny teeth are said to have passed wine, arah, once or twice. For instance, in Ka'ab ibn Zuhair's 7th century Qasidat al-Burda, the Mantle Ode. It is not surprising that the drinking of wine is associated with many more aspects in Ottoman poetry of well a millennium later, and in the following we shall survey some exemplary developments of the wine motif in the Ottoman poetry of male and female poets, namely Fuzuli, Balkhī, Mihri Hatun, and Leila Saz. So I will just skip the pride and honor bit of pre-Islamic poetry because I hope I covered that. And we will move on to the other aspects that I have identified or that I would like to talk about. And they are libation, drinking with the beloved, wine imagery, and satire. So with regard to the libation, I mentioned this, these two verses already. So Mihjan al-Thaqafi is famed to have said these lines to his son. إذا مت فادفني لأصل كرامة تروع عظامي في التراب عروقها ولا تدفني بالفلا فإنني أخاف إذا ما مت أن لا أذوقها. So when I'm dead, bury me next to a grapevine, the essence of which shall drench my buried bones' thirst. Do not bury me in a waterless desert, for I fear once I'm dead, I will not be able to taste the wine anymore. I think this goes well on the libation, together with the next poem by al-Khansa, who is probably the most famous Arab poetess. What she says in one of her marthiyas, in her grief poems about her brothers and sons, she ends one of them with the words أسقى الإله ضريحه من صوب دائمة الرهائم. So not with wine. So may God keep his grave moist or water it with a continuous light drizzle of rain. I think the asqa, the verb saqa yasqi in fourth form asqa, is often found in wine poetry, especially the active participle, the fa'il form in form 1, saqi, who is the cupbearer. I'm not sure in how far this actually relates to wine poetry here, but the vocabulary is similar. As to drinking with the beloved, I also mentioned this short poem by Al-Asha. He says, her innocent young neck I inclined to myself, towards me, and fondled the decorate girdle of her belly, like yellow casket of perfumes mixed with unguent. And there she had hung up above us a skin of wine to drink, ta'mura or tamura. Somebody read namura, a ewer or container for wine. Now, this image is well expanded in Mihri Hatun's, a 15th century Ottoman poetess, poem. And that is a classical theme of Ottoman poetry, also according to Orhan Pamuk in his Masumiyet Müzisi. He says, bu evden çıkmanın divan şiirindeki şarabın sevgiliyle yan yana oturmanın mutluluğu kadar sokaktaki kalabalıkla birlikte olmanın da mutluluğuydu. I hope we will be soon able to enjoy some crowds in the streets as well. So what does Mihri Hatun say? She says, I will read the Ottoman, or I'll try, because I'm not sure about the voweling, and there is an English translation next to it, which I prepared. Yine eyyam-ı bahar irdi bezendi her diyar, kıldı afaki şüküfeyle müzeyen girtgar. Nice nakşitti görol nakkaş sonundan yine her dirahtı hamdan gösterdi bir ruhi nigar. Devlet anlarım ki bu esnad ola gülzardan bir elinde cami sar, bir elinde zülfiyar. Gah yanağından gül, ala, geh levinden mül anın, geh miyanını der aguş ide, geh buse kenar. Gül gibi güldü yine alem bahar ile bugün. Suretin keşfeyledi gülzare benzer şehriyar. Kaddi dil cusini gördü raksa girdi servler. Ana germ olup çemende ayasın karsar çenan. Her gülendamın hevasına meyi cam iç yürü. Arif isen fırsatı feftitme bu dem zinhar. Didi mihri ol güle ben gibi bülbül mü olur? Didi kim? Ben görürüm günde senin gibi hezar. So this is a ghazal, a love poem. And the idea in here is that the female poet is actually caressing her beloved in the garden while having a drink, but in a way more elaborate form. Leyla San's late Ottoman poet, also from Istanbul, has a similar poem, but actually it's about jealousy and competition in love. She says, bu şebol şu cefa pişe ile mey çakalım, reşke tabe seher kalbi rakibi yakalım. Naveki aham ile eyleyip ağyara helak, yine ölmezse eğer başına çengel takalım. Gidelim semti rakibeki gaza niyetine, kafirin başına bari iki enser kakalım. Semtine uğramayıp nazi diyor Leyla'ya, yine biz cüra sıfat kuyuna yarın akalım. So even the word for, the competitor's district is fluid. It's a liquid word. Akalım is to let us flow, just like wine. So the imagery, the wine motif here is used to actually inform more of the poem, more parts of the poem than just like to say, let's have a drink with my beloved under a tree. To further this a little bit, I'm sorry, this is very contemporary. It's a folk song from Mardin, and it includes these two lines, which I find very nice. They say, Dalali yishrab araq, mezeto shefetki, agarin kasar qadahu, yishrab min ghamzetki. So my beloved is drinking araq, and his meze are your lips. And if his qadah, if his goblet breaks, then let him drink from your dimple. Isn't that cute? I find it very cute. And about wine imagery, now it becomes real. So in Imr al-Qais's poem, we had the finches that were described as having as being drunk, quaffed the choicest of sweet wines rich with spices. In Al-Khansā's poem, we already said and established, I mean, it's well known that she's a poet of grief. But in one of her poems, she describes her terror and her state when she heard of her brother's loss. She describes herself as walking like a akhul khamr. Laysa illa akhul khamr. So a brother of wine, a drunkard, right? She doesn't say that she would be drunk, but she describes herself in this male form, which is potentially telling. In one of her other poems, she describes also the gas, the goblet, but not filled with wine. But in this case, she says that her tribe has caught this guy from the other tribe, Abs, and they have given him in the morning, صبحنا عبسا بكأس وليس بكأس المدام, with a glass, but not a glass full of wine, but something else. And if we look into one of her other poems, she uses the same image again, but here she says, you will remember the verse from the Quran, كل نفس ذائقة الموت, and she says, وكل معمر سيذوق كأس منيا. So the goblet of death, everybody alive will taste it. And I found this also, or I think I found it in, I'll skip this one for now. I found it in another pop song, a Lebanese pop song, which is, I think, a wedding classic for like 30 years, بيقولوا شو ما بيقولوا, by Wael Kfouri. And he says, وبيقولوا تركتني بغربي تتسقيني مر الكاس. And they say that my beloved has left me in a foreign land in order to give me to drink the bitter cup, which I think is related and is an image that is living on even to into our days. We mentioned the description of female beauty, like in terms of shiny teeth, as if wine has passed through them. So we skip this as well. And we come to Fuzuli, one of the more prominent Ottoman poets. In one of his ghazals, which is very famous and it has been set to music just a few years ago by Iranian Azerbaijani Navid Mosma, which goes, Ey keman ebru, shahidi khanjari mujganuna, bulmusham feyzi nazar senden senin qurbanuna. Now the problem with Fuzuli is that he lived in the 16th century, and there is different manuscripts of his poetry, and you can vocalize this almost as you wish. But the problem is that there is different editions. There's Turkish editions and there's Azeri editions. So because in the 16th century, Turkish, Azeri, and Turkmen had not evolved yet, right? So Azerbaijan is claiming him as their national poet. I've again given a transliteration here. You will hopefully be able to read all of this one day, soon, I hope. But I will just go with the English now because it is important. This is quite a different thing, and we've already heard about Sufi poetry, and I think this one has a lot of Sufi vocabulary in it. So he says, "Oh, you with a bow-like brow, I felt martyr to the dagger of your lashes. You graced me with a look, I'm your sacrifice. I have tied the thread of my heart to the string of your locks. For your own sake, have mercy on me. Once, for my heart is spinning for you. What if I were to give up wine to please the ascetics? What should I do with the joy of wine? I'm crazy for you. 100 comb-like arrows of grief pierced my soul, and I became a captive of your musk-scented sidelocks. The physician has given up on curing me and turned away, as if he understood that I'm falling for your seducing eyes. If you want my soul, order me and I will surrender it to you. You are the ruler, and I'm one of your slaves at your command. The bud doesn't make my love-stricken heart happy. The rose doesn't make it bloom. I just desire your rosy cheeks and your smiling lips. Fate, don't make my heart bleed and don't make me sigh at myself at every moment. Honor me for a day or two, for I'm your guest. Fuzuli, you burn me with the fire of sighs. Probably you thought that I'm a candle in your house of woe. So as if this wasn't spiritual and religious enough, since it's Eid al-Adha, happy Eid everybody, by the way, There is another verse that was added into an Iranian edition of Fuzuli's poetry, which goes, only once a year people sacrifice an animal for the feast, but I'm your sacrifice at every moment and every hour. So I think this is well beyond wine poetry. He's not speaking about drinking wine, but he is just playing on the idea of feeling intoxicated for the intensity that he feels towards his beloved or unconsummated love. He also has, I think I'll give two more examples. One of them goes, Hoş ol ki demi ecel çeken bade inab, sermest yatan kabırda ta ruzi hesab. Kavgayı kıyamette duran mesti harab, ne fikri hesab ola, ne idraki azab. It would be good if I drank pure wine at the moment of death. I would lie joyfully in the grave until the day of judgment. At the turmoil of resurrection, I would stand dead drunk, without a thought about giving account or awareness of punishment. Now, there is this antithesis between religious thought and drinking, right? And I think we should not be translating this face value, but we should apply some metaphysical theory or implement it in our translation and our interpretation of these poems. There is also another one, but I'll skip this for now because I think I'm running out of time soon. Just wanted to say there is real drinking, obviously, and one of the modern Ḥamīriyas, if you wish, is by Sıla Gençoğlu. She's a very famous Turkish pop singer, and I think in 2013 she wrote this song herself. And in the refrain, she says, "Sen durma koy saki içeceğiz." So cupbearer, don't stop, just pour in and we will drink, because she's hiding her love. She's like secretly in love with somebody and she can't tell anybody. And my two favorite poems are this one and the next one. Both are by Balkhī, the Sultan of Ottoman poet, 16th century. In the first one, he actually describes a real event, which was that the Sultan set some wine-laden ships on fire. It goes, the Sultan's sword cut the way to the tavern, like water it cut off the path between Istanbul and Galata. The wine ships are left between water and fire. The wind drowned the basics of their rain's enjoyment. The seawater that is mixed with wine, dawn-like in color, glares on the deep blue sea like the crescent moon. Again, an Islamic symbol next to the wine. Do not think that it is fire that burns the ship on the water. The sparks of Shah Suleiman's sword of wrath set it ablaze. The dance of the harp and the reed flute encircling wine cups is past. Now enjoy the worldly life, O hypocritical Sufi. The goblets are devoid of pure wine. The taverns are empty. How did the hypocrites find the empty space, the empty place? Balkhī, in a world where constantly 9 goblets, peymane, are turning. What a life is that? And it's telling that here he uses a different word, peymane, and I think he satirizes on the Sufis' sema dance and says now that there is no alcohol left to drink, to be drunk, to be had in secret, what a life would that be? And my absolutely top favorite poem, if I can, do I still have time? It's just 5 lines, is this one by Balkhī. It goes, I will actually read it and I hope I won't laugh. So, Sakiya, camime ne hoş gül olur, eline kim alırsa bülbül olur. Bir gören taze dağ başımda ne güzel kırmızı karanfil olur. Game zülfünle dudi ahi kebut, laciverdi latif sümbül olur. Rişte-i muyi dilbere tolaşan, deste-i bendi zülfü kakül olur. Baki abi vasrın irmezse, ateşi hecriyle yanar kül olur. So it is a love poem to wine, actually, but it satirizes all the imagery that we know of normal ghazal poetry. And I want to finish with this image, which is, I think, an anonymous line of poetry that sometimes is attributed to Fuzuli. And it says, bir gül dedi bülbül güle, gül gülmedi gitti. Gül bülbüle, bülbül gül. Sorry, gül bülbüle, bülbül güle yar olmadı gitti. You know the imagery of like the rose and the nightingale? So in Turkish, this means the nightingale said to the rose, smile at just once, but the rose did not smile, it just left. Or the rose didn't smile, finished, tamam şöyle. And in the second line, it says, the rose did not become a beloved to the nightingale, nor did the nightingale become a beloved to the rose. Just end of story. And yeah, that's why I like this poem by Balkhī, because it inverts the whole imagery that we're used to and satirizes one genre through another. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to all four of our speakers. And Simon Lisa, I see you have your hand up and the floor is now open for a discussion.
I was trying to clap, but I did it wrong. Sorry. No, I don't. I don't have a question. I was meant to do this.
Oh, yes, I see. I thought that was a raised hand, and if somebody familiar with the format wants to correct me, please, I won't feel offended. Yes, Amin Abu Khail, I see your hand.
Okay. Hello, good evening. I'm Abu Khail, assistant professor from Algeria. Thank you very much for this rich conference and presentation. I have two questions. My first question for Professor Alaaeldin, I want to know the motive for writing Maqāmāt, because the motive in Arabian Maqāmāt, it's not the same in Persian Maqāmāt. Why was written Maqāmāt in Persian? Of course, it was not for teaching Persian language. And my second question for Simon, thank you very much for your rich presentation. My question is why the poet choose many language to write his poetry, especially in Munajat? Why there are 2 or 3 languages at same space, at same time? As for to show the poet was able to express for many language, or the aesthetic function. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Amina, so much for your question. And you were asking about the motivation or the motive behind writing Maqāmāt in Persian. As I mentioned in my presentation, that during the time when Qadi Ḥamīd Balkhī started writing his Maqāmāt, that was the time when was quite influence of the Arabic language in general, the Arabic literatures and the Arabic Maqāmāt as well. And the idea of showing, like by, let's say, Persian literati, Persian writers, they wanted to show that they are able to master the language. They are able to write something that is artful, that is skillful, that has the san'a or صناعة الإنشاء, or the art of composing. One other thing about some motive for writing the Persian Maqāmāt, I believe, is that at that time bilingualism also was very pervasive. It was very common that Persian writers, Persian intellectuals, they were very easily, they can move from Arabic to Persian. So that was also some sort of an exercising that they were competent in both languages. So I think that was the basic drive or motive for them to write the Maqāmāt. I hope that I answered your question, Amina. Hello?
Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Amina, as well for your question. Yeah, I mean, I guess it's a question for that. Yeah, that everyone here might be asking, why write in more than one language at a time? For the things I was showing, you know, there's various things going on. So there's translation going on. You know, sometimes it's this interlinear thing going on the glosses. But the takhmis that I showed is also, it's kind of a translation as well, because there's some repetition, of course, in the Persian of what's going on in the Arabic. But also, clearly it demonstrates that the poet is able to work with these, to use the same, to work with meter and rhyme, skillfully enough across these two languages, for example, to make this successful. But also why not? Because these are languages people knew. So why would they confine themselves to one language? Yes, I don't know. I'm not sure that answers your question, but with the takhmis especially, there's obviously some affinity with the talmi' that Ali was talking about earlier. There's some aesthetic joy to be brought from playing with two languages in this way. Also, as an act of devotion as well, because you're preserving this munajat, but also and showing your reverence for it, as well as demonstrating your own artistry and so on. So there's lots of literal answers, I think, to your question, but hopefully they were relevant.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yes, and Huda, I see that you have your hand up.
Thank you, Christopher. Thank you all for a brilliant panel as well. My comment is for Simon, not a question. So as I was listening to your very interesting paper, I was thinking of the radif in English. What do you make of English language ghazals that are very common these days in American poetry, and the radif in English? That's another layer of the radif's journey into other languages. So
it's very interesting. What's interesting, because in English, obviously with syntax in English, it just often doesn't, it's more difficult to make it work, basically. So often it feels, so it's interesting. But
actually, Goethe copied some radifs in his Westlicher Divan. If you want a poem like in tausend Formen magst du dich verstecken, is one of the poems in which he has copied the radif. Also, not the rhyming scheme, which goes A, B, A, B, but every four lines end on the same word.
Okay.
That's 18th century.
Okay. I might email you about that.
Sure.
Okay, thanks.
And Orhan, we all enjoyed your examples very much, but I also wanted to note that your first example from Khansa, I don't think it has anything to do with wine. And this is the tradition of istisqa, where you wish for rain to fall on a dead person's grave. And there's a long tradition of that from pre-Islamic poetry onwards. But the other example has wine, has khamr for sure.
Yeah.
Just a note, but thank you very much.
Well, it's also a tradition that you still can see today at funerals, where people pour some water on a fresh grave.
Water.
But also the libation, where you properly pour wine, but real wine, in the memory of some deceased soldiers, for example.
So yeah, there must be a connection then, since they all come from the same.
Well, it's actually the Bible, and it's also in the story of Ahiqan in the Syriac versions, where you find that you should pour good wine, rather than wasting it. You should pour it on somebody memorable's grave. That's why I linked it, because I think the tradition is much older. I mean, I didn't want to bring in Syriac, but there's actually Syriac pop songs. Christina Rossetti says, "When I'm dead, my dear, be the green grass above me," right? And once I saw a Syriac music video on TV. For my life, I can't find it, but I swear to God, what he said was, "When I'm dead, plant a grapevine over my grave, so that my bones can drink from its wine." I just can't find it, but it all connects nicely together.
Well, it reminds me of Khayyam, a Ruba'iyya by Khayyam.
That as well, he has it as well. But I left Persian out because I thought that I will barely get through my examples, but then I just did it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Ali, I see that you have you're raising your hand.
Yeah, thank you so much for these amazing talks, everybody. I had a quick question for Simon, because you sort of teased us with this notion of the specificity of language. And I kind of wanted you to sort of get more into that, because I mean, you're talking about a context that has so many languages, right? It's not just three. And even building on Huda's point about English, I mean, I remember there's this like famous video from Pakistan's TV in like the 1970s of the Burda being recited in Arabic, Persian, Urdu, and Saraiki, and English. And they sing it beautifully in Arabic, they sing it beautifully in Persian, in Urdu and Saraiki, but when they get to English, they stop singing. And they just do a monotone, what's it called? And I mean, I've often thought of like both the specificity of language, but also how this multilingualism is about, particularly through meter and through radif and through these other techniques of making a single song, right? And how much of this poetry was sung. So like, if you could just, I mean, I'm interested in your thoughts about it.
Yeah, well, so it's something, so Azad uses this words a lot and related words, you know, something's mukhtas bil Arabiya and this kind of thing. And sometimes it's talking, he is talking about grammatical forms and so on, and he talks about those in a kind of neutral way, although he puts Sanskrit on a pedestal because it has three genders, and he thinks, okay, there's more grammar, so it's great. But also there's this, so there's a sense of kind of grammar and structures and so on, but also a sense of sweetness and what works in different language, what sounds nice and so on, which of course we have, you know. People always say that Persian is Shireen, right? So it's there's these ideas kind of yeah, they're there anyway, and you know, he's not the first person to talk about them. Yeah, and so it's interesting. So you know, the idea that he says the radif is he says it's mukhtas bil ajam or something like this, but then he uses it, right? So it's a bit of a game he plays with it anyway. But yeah, there's the song, the sound of it and how sweet it sounds and how well it works in song. I think that's definitely part of it, which is difficult to say why he says there's halawa in the radif in Persian. I mean, why is there halawa in Persian and not in Arabic? It's a bit, you know, the easy answer is very subjective, but yeah, but yeah, it's an interesting point.
And it is a very interesting concept, and I think it was widely known. I only know the saying Hindi namak, Farsi shirin, va Turki hunar ast.
Yeah, yeah.
Are there other questions for any of our panelists? Floor is still open for discussion. Okay. Feel free to cybernetically raise your hand or simply unmute yourself, if you would. Well, I have a lot of questions that I could continue to ask, but I think that in the interest of time, I will reserve my comments for personal communications with all four of you. And if there are not further questions or comments, I would like once again to thank all four of our panelists, and I'd like to thank our organizers for organizing this conference. And I know how challenging it is under these circumstances, which of course we all hope will end soon. So thank you very much. And
thank you so much, Chris, for this beautiful conclusion, and thank you so much for the last panel. It was really good, like a good final cask of wine, as Orhan used. We really enjoyed all the presentations today, and we thank also Professor Fatima for the opening lecture. So tomorrow will be another interesting day with more brilliant papers. Please make sure that you register for the second day, and see you tomorrow all. And thank you all for being part of this beautiful movement. And we really enjoyed your papers again. Thank you all again. And thank you again for everyone.
Thank you.